Today I'd like to talk about windrow grazing in Nebraska as a tool we can use to cost effectively harvest forage. Why windrow graze? That's a question I often get asked, but when we windrow graze, what we're doing is preserving forage quality just like we would if we were going to put it up as harvested feed, either as silage or hay. With windrow grazing, we can potentially significantly reduce labor, harvesting, and feeding cost, and also we can return most of the organic matter and nutrients back to the ground that crop was harvested from, reducing future fertilizer expense. This is a picture of some cows being fed hay on a snowy day, and we could say in theory that these cows are actually being windrow fed. That bale processor there is laying that hay out in a windrow. These cows here are also being windrow fed, except they're being fed windrow feed that was put in that windrow back the following late summer, early fall, and now when the snow has come, we're using a high tensile or electric fence wire, temporary electric wire, to windrow graze these cows, moving the electric fence, giving them new feed every day. The cost of this electric fence wire or temporary electric fence polywire is significantly less expensive than that tractor and bale processor that we saw in the prior slide. So reducing harvested feeding expense can be a big benefit of windrow grazing. Let's look at some back of the envelope kind of economics of windrow grazing versus baling and feeding as hay. In this example, I'm going to assume a 2 ton per acre yield, and let's just say we're going to utilize an annual forage to compare this. So let's say we windrowed the annual forage, we had 2 ton per acre yield. It's going to cost us on average around $12 per acre to have it windrowed, or the swathing expense is going to be $6 per ton. If we include some fencing and labor expense to feed that windrow forage back to the cattle, it's going to cost us around $10 per ton to swath it and then feed it out to the cattle. If we go ahead and include swathing costs, baling costs, hauling the bale hay off the field and then hauling the hay back out to the cattle, we include all those costs. If we were to bale the crop and then feed it, we're going to be somewhere around $57 per ton if we figure out the cost to actually get it delivered to the cattle. And so we're saving around somewhere close to $47 per ton with windrow grazing versus harvesting that as bales and then hauling it back out to the cattle as baled feed. I also should mention there, we're not including the benefit of the manure and urine, the nutrients that we return back to that crop ground that we harvested the forage from, that we get the benefit from if we utilize windrow grazing. This is a chart that shows a comparison of losses if we think about the crop standing in the field and then think about all the operations involved from that crop standing till we get it actually wrapped up in a bale and then delivered out to the cattle. This shows again the dry matter loss that occurs. And so there's a lot of different processes that we go through from the time that crop is standing till we actually feed it to the cattle. We can have as much as from as little as 10% loss up to as much as 80% loss, depending upon the different wastes that occur and losses that happen in that harvesting and feeding process. Probably we're going to lose at least around 30-35% on average if we look at this value or the forage that's there in the standing crop versus what we actually get into the cow. And so when we look at this, we can see that windrow grazing probably doesn't actually lose very much forage as we compare to the option of feeding it as baled hay. So why does windrow grazing work in the fall and winter? What allows us to do that effectively? This is a picture of some weaned heifer calves grazing windrowed oats. This would have been oats that was windrowed in the fall. In this case, the electric fence has been hung on the pivot, and these particular producers are moving their pivot as a way to strip graze these windrows of these oats. Windrow grazing works in the High Plains region due to the seasonal moisture pattern that we have as we think about windrow grazing in the fall and winter. Out at Kimball, Nebraska, we're going to average close to 17 inches of precip annually. About 14 inches of that precip comes in the months of March through September, while only about 2.8 or almost 3 inches come in the months of October through February. So 80% of our moisture comes in that March through September time frame. This is a graph just showing the seasonality of precipitation in Nebraska, and you can see our driest period of time tends to be that October through February time period. There has been some research done in Nebraska looking at windrow grazing on a perennial type situation. This was research done up at the Goodmanson Sandhills lab back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they windrowed some meadows, also baled some of those meadows, and then compared performance of calves and the cost of feeding those calves, either windrowed forage or taking those bales and feeding them in a dry lot scenario. In their research, they showed that windrow grazing the calves out on the meadows, swath grazing those calves, netted them $10 more per head as compared to feeding them baled hay from the same meadow. There's also been some research on annual forages done in northeast Colorado, specifically looking at windrowed foxtail millet and comparing bred heifers grazing foxtail millet in the late fall and early winter prior to calving, or feeding those same heifers baled foxtail millet from the same field, and then comparing their performance and the cost involved with both processes. With this particular set of research data, they showed that grazing the swath foxtail millet saved anywhere from 18 cents to 43 cents per head per day over feeding the heifers baled foxtail millet, and there was no difference in animal performance. Windrow grazing in the spring and summer provides an interesting opportunity under current economics in Nebraska. Again, as we think about windrow grazing, we're trying to capture that annual forage at its optimum of quality and quantity to meet the nutrient requirements of the cattle we're going to feed. Windrow grazing, I think, can increase harvest efficiency to almost 90 to 90% of that standing crop in terms of getting it into the cattle when we windrow graze, versus direct grazing a standing crop of annual forages where we might only get 30 to 50% utilization. Windrow grazing provides us the opportunity with a spring and summer annual to be competitive with direct grazing perennial forages at current pasture prices when we look at price per pound of forage produced. This is a graph that shows a relationship between forage quality and quantity of annual forages. We think about those forages going through their early growth phase and onto maturity. We can see at the early vegetative state down here in the lower left-hand corner, forage quality is extremely high, but the amount of forage that's there, the quantity is low. As that plant moves into the vegetative and stem elongation state and starts to move into the reproductive stage, quality starts to drop off, and quantity, or the yield that we have out there, increases pretty rapidly. Somewhere in the period here between where the quality and quantity line cross is really our optimum in terms of harvest opportunity. We might be a little earlier if we're grazing some calves on windrows and we want a higher quality feed, or we might let the feed go to a later stage of maturity if we're grazing it with something like later gestation cow-calf pairs or dry cows, so we're capturing more pounds per acre. This is an interesting graph showing the cost per pair per month and what the equivalent value of the forage those cows are consuming would be equal to on a per ton basis if we think about what's going into those cows on an air-dried forage basis. Typically, a cow-calf pair in Nebraska a spring calving cow would expect to harvest around 1.5 animal unit months, which is equivalent to about 1,200 pounds of air-dried forage per month if we think about a 5-month grazing season, June through October. So if we're looking at $35 per pair per month, if we think about that 1,200 pounds of air-dried forage that cow's consuming, that's equivalent to around $58 per ton if we think about it on a price per ton equivalent. And you can see as we move up in terms of cost per pair per month, the price per ton equivalent starts to become pretty significant when we move up to around $55, $65, $75 per ton. If we're going to utilize spring and summer windrow grazing, here are some suggestions I think we need to be careful about, or at least have thought through, and some opportunities to take advantage of if we utilize windrow grazing in the spring and summer with summer annuals. First, we want to test those forages for nitrates before we windrow them. We want to identify what do we have out there in the field, and do we need to do anything from a management standpoint to try to mitigate any nitrates that might be present. Things like raising the cutter bar, maybe letting that plant go to a later stage of maturity to hopefully reduce nitrates, are options that we have available. And there might be some scenarios when we look at the forage that's there that maybe we can't direct graze or windrow graze, and maybe we'll just have to go ahead and either chop it for silage or bale it up and then blend it with some other lower nitrate feeds to be able to utilize it. As we think about spring and summer windrow grazing, we don't want to windrow more than what those cattle will eat in a 1 to 2 week time period. This is especially important, I think, especially in that May, June, early July time frame when we can get some wet weather that could cause windrows to deteriorate. As we move later in this summer out to that late August, September time period, we might be able to windrow a greater length of forage available ahead of those cows, or even actually windrow the whole field and preserve quality of that forage as we move from the summer into fall, early winter, and not really see any detriment to forage quality. But windrow grazing again in that early spring, early summer time period, we probably don't want more than 1 or 2 weeks of forage out ahead of those cattle. We also want to have a sacrifice area or pasture we can move the cattle off the field to should we get into some wet conditions so we don't bog that ground, cause some compaction. We also are probably going to get the best utilization if we use daily moves with those cattle. Going to waste the least amount of forage in the spring and summer doing that. Then I also think we want to think about the opportunity to plan out a forage chain using both spring and summer annuals along with planting dates. So maybe we have a chain of forage that's maturing at different times through the late spring and summer that allows us to windrow that forage throughout the spring and summer, capturing that forage at its optimum between forage production or quantity and the quality of the forage that's there. This is just a picture of how we might lay out a field and utilize windrow grazing. You can see in the lower left-hand corner we have the water there, and we're moving our temporary electric fence away from the water. These are some tools that we have available to us for windrow grazing, things like a polywire reel, a temporary electric fence post. All are tools that can really make windrow grazing fairly simple and cost effective. This is a picture of some cows windrow grazing in the fall and winter. This would be some pictures from Canada where they actually have a longer winter period. But again, you can see the polywire in the foreground there. Those cows are windrow grazing some annual forage that was grown and then swathed in the late summer, early fall, grazing it through the snow without any problem. This is some picture of calves being windrow grazed on some foxtail millet. This would have been done in the southern panhandle here. You can see again the electric fence in the foreground, calves grazing some new windrows there in the background. This was windrowed in late August, early September, and we had some regrowth on that foxtail millet. It tried to regrow, and you can see that little head there. These calves are grazing, again, that regrowth as well as what's in the windrow. Just another picture of these calves windrow grazing. This is a picture of what the windrow looked when we turned it over or looked underneath what was in the windrow in late September, early October. You can see the quality was still very good. Windrow was green underneath, no musty or moldy presence there, and still very palatable to the calves. This is a picture of a operation southwest of Sidney that utilized windrow grazing with some late spring calving cows. These were cows that were grazing with their calves still in January on the windrowed foxtail millet. This was foxtail millet that was grazed under a low capacity well, and then these calves were left on the cows and grazing the windrows. This picture shows the temporary electric fence, this poly wire in the foreground there, and then you can see a pigtail post here in the background. The windrows here are on this side of the fence. Of course, the cow-calf pairs are on the other side. This was harvested with a draper head, so we had some big, deep, heavy windrows. If you kick the windrow over, as we did here, you can see a picture of what it looked like underneath. Brown on top, but underneath green, nice looking feed. This is a picture of that windrow forage up close. Again, you can see looks like what it would have looked like honestly if we'd have unrolled it as a bale. Here's what's coming through the cows at this point, and so based on what was coming through them, pretty highly digestible feed. So here's where I think swath grazing summer annuals or even cool season annuals may be a good fit. When spring and summer pasture is expensive, as it is in Nebraska right now, and crop prices are low, in that type of scenario, we might have a situation where we can actually make more money by grazing cattle on annual forages utilizing swath grazing in the spring and summer as we could compared to grazing or raising a grain crop or compared to taking those cows to expensive pasture. Windrow grazing annual forages really does work well in the fall and winter, especially if you move west of, say, the 100th meridian. As we get past that point, humidity is low. Seasonal precip tends to be low also at that time of year, so we can windrow that forage in the late summer, early fall, and preserve quality through the fall and winter. It can work well for backgrounding calves, for fall or winter calving cows, or as just an alternative feed resource when crop residue isn't available or winter pasture is expensive. Swath grazing perennials might fit in a scenario where maybe we had some aftermath growths on alfalfa or hay that we'd harvested and then want to windrow that forage to preserve quality. Could then graze those windrows in the late fall and early winter with weaned calves or replacement heifers. There might be also an opportunity on a wet meadow type situation where we could maybe graze early in the spring, maybe if we had an irrigated meadow or a sub-irrigated meadow, and then take the cattle off, allow that forage to regrow, and then come back and windrow that forage in the late summer, early fall, and then graze those windrows on into the winter. Obviously, water is important as we think about windrow grazing. We have to have available stock water to utilize those windrows. Snow can be a water source for us, but we want to be careful, I think, to depend on that snow, especially in parts of the country where maybe we don't have a dependable snow type of source. Cows will graze through snow, and really deep snow is not a problem for cows in windrow grazing. If we get a lot of snow and that snow crusts, we may need to go out and break the crust so that those cows can dig through the snow. But once they know the windrow's there, if we break through the crust, those cows will dig through a lot of snow to get to the windrows. Dr. Jerry Valesky, who's at the West Central Research and Extension Center, and myself had developed a NED guide on windrow grazing, and would encourage you to look at that resource if you're thinking about utilizing this as a tool in your operation. Finally, have any questions, please contact me either by email or phone. We'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about windrow grazing.